Dear Professor Jackson, ladies and gentlemen, dear students, dear members of the universities and dear guests, a very warm welcome to everybody to this evening lecture here. On behalf of TU Berlin and also on behalf of the Council for Sustainability at TU Berlin, whom I'm the chairwoman of, I would like to welcome you here, and I have to say that we are very proud having you here again at TU Berlin and giving us this interesting lecture about prosperity without growth. It is not the first time that you are here at TU Berlin. It's just 5 years ago when we had the possibility here to listen to you when we discussed with Professor Edenhofer here in the framework of our climate lecture. And it was a very interesting discussion about green growth, and I'm very happy that we again have the possibility to have you here, that you followed our invitation, and that we have the possibility to hear more about your recent work in this field. This evening will be led by Franz-Josef. He is also member of the Council for Sustainability here at TU Berlin, and he organized this event, and I'm very happy that he's going to lead you through the evening and also give you the possibility in the end to have discussion here with Professor Jackson. So I hand this micro over to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I do not want to waste your time. Just a few words. Professor Jackson, who agreed to be here today, is, I think, really a precious person for us all if we look at the future that expects us. We realize the climate change already, and we find that limits of growth that were already in focus in the 80s or earlier are becoming reality. And maybe you know, Professor Jackson wrote the book Prosperity Without Growth after his report for the Commission in the UK was not fully respected, but the book later was. So the people read about the hypothesis that growth is surely limited on Earth. But Professor Jackson didn't stop to show this as a kind of dystopy. He suggested that we should change our understanding of prosperity, that we should change our mind and not focus on consumption, but think sustainability and wealth and prosperity in a different way. Spending money for investments in social and the people. And I don't want to talk too much about your talk. So thanks a lot for coming, Professor Jackson.
Zuerst einmal vielen Dank für die Einladung, Magdalena. Es ist ein Vergnügen, hierher zu sein, nochmal mit Ihnen, um Wohlstand und Wachstum zu reden. Aber warum sind Sie da? Warum seid ihr da? Ein Donnerstagabend, es regnet draußen, alles kalt draußen und jetzt seid ihr hier mit mir, um sowas zu reden. Das ist mir immer noch ein bisschen komisch. Why are you here? What are you doing here? I suspect 5 years is a long time in politics. It's quite a long time in academia as well, and you forgot the entertainment value of myself and Ottmar Edenhofer here on stage with Frau Prinzler, glaube ich, from the site, going loggerheads over the question of whether or not we could have green growth, whether or not we could continue to keep this iconic religious concept of economic growth, and yet somehow magically stay within the ecological limits of the planet. And that's it is an important argument to have. I'm a little bit skeptical of it at this point in time, I have to say, because it seems as though there are a great many people on the growth side who are not going to give that position up easily. And there's a few people, an increasing number of people, I would say, who are skeptical of that position, but don't necessarily yet have the tools to articulate a different possibility, a possibility of prosperity without growth. We don't know what such an economy looks like. We don't really know what such a society looks like. We have a series of impossibility theorems presented to us by conventional economists and by politicians. And we're asked, on the basis of those impossibility theorems, really to give up logic, to give up argumentation, to give up inquiry, and to accept the status quo. And so if I were to suggest why you're here, I would think that it might have something to do with the fact that you're not prepared to do that there is an inquiry out there, a serious inquiry. There are questions in your mind, the sorts of questions that might assault actually a rather young child when you presented them with a picture of planet Earth and said, can you imagine the human species growing forever, creating more and more junk, throwing everything away, destroying this planet? Is growth possible on a finite planet? And I have had such conversations, and they say, no, of course it's not. It's not. Kenneth Boulding once said, anyone who thinks that growth can go on forever on a finite planet is either a madman or an economist. And there are plenty of economists out there who will still make that case that growth is possible. I've not exactly given up countering that argument, but I think it's more important really to begin to build the foundations of something different, what I call the foundations of the economy tomorrow. So what I want to do here this evening is actually three things, I suppose. One is to think a little bit philosophically about what prosperity really means. We've been sold the vision of prosperity cashed out as economic output and materialism and consumerism for the last 50 to 100 years. But actually there's a body of knowledge which really, if you take it seriously, doesn't allow you any longer to believe that idea. It's nothing more than an idealistic notion of a cornucopia, a materialistic cornucopia that just doesn't exist and cannot really exist on a planet which is bound by the second law of thermodynamics, amongst other natural foundations. So that's number one, is to think, if it's not that, then what on earth can it be? My foundational question, if you like, and the question that also guides the research group as I'm running in the UK at the moment: what can prosperity possibly mean in a world of environmental and social limits? And then the second thing I want to do is to address the architecture of a self-made crisis. What I see as a crisis that broke on public consciousness in 2008 with the financial crisis, but has emerged, has revealed itself to be a much bigger crisis, a crisis of the kind of organization, of the kind of society in which today we live. And I will suggest, in the course of that forensic analysis of what's gone wrong, I will in fact suggest that part of what's gone wrong is our absolute clinging to the notion that what we want out of society is continual economic growth. I do think that plays a part in it. But there are much more tragic things going on within that crisis. A crisis that affects the 2 billion people across the world who don't have proper provisions or decent energy supplies or clean water or sufficient housing. The crisis of those left behind, even in our own rich economies, a crisis of inequality. And I want to say a little bit about that particular crisis in the second element of my talk. And then finally, what I want to do is to suggest, and it'll be no more than suggestion, that we do not have to live with all these impossibility theorems, that it is possible in a rigorous, scientific, humanistic way to reinvent our own economics, to reinvent our sense of what society is, our sense of what progress is. And in a way that brings me right back to the first and most fundamental question. What can prosperity possibly mean on a world in which we are faced with limits? This question of limits has sometimes been incredibly politically sensitized, and sensitized also in people's hearts and minds. When the Limits to Growth report was published in the early 1970s and had such a huge impact, almost everybody from the establishment wanted to get out and knock it down because we don't like the idea of limits. Ronald Reagan at one point stood up to knock it down and said there are no limits to economic growth because there are no limits to human ingenuity. And that is a position actually that I find is quite favourable with even some of my own students, because that idea that we are an ingenious species is an incredibly important one. It's an enabling one. It actually is a liberating one, because it gives us the possibility that we can overcome certain kinds of limits. We can move our way around those limits. The question, though, is, can we sufficiently overcome those limits that we no longer have to take seriously the problems of climate change, the devastation of species that's happened actually in the 47 years since the Limits to Growth report was first published? Can we overcome limits of thermodynamics? Can we really create energy out of absolutely nothing and make our societies live on it? It may be that if you redefine energy, if you define it in ways that are not yet defined in physics, that kind of transformation might be possible. But there's a kind of a hubris, there's a kind of a pride, an overweening pride in our own technological ability to overcome all of these limits. And one of the biggest casualties of that pride is actually the openness of mind to think differently about what it means to be human. To think differently about what prosperity means. To think differently about our relation to the planet that we live on, to think differently about our relationships to each other. Limits, properly understood, said the philosopher Wendell Berry, are in fact an invitation to a conversation. They're the beginnings of understanding the opportunities that do exist for us beyond the futile dreams of endless, infinite energy and material throughput. And that's an invitation that I think we should take seriously for all sorts of reasons. One of them is that actually it has a long, long pedigree in itself. You might be surprised to know that actually some of the founding fathers of economics were prepared to take that questioning position in relation to the idea of limits and indeed to the idea of growth. John Stuart Mill, writing in 1848, said he was in the middle at this point of constructing a theory of economics that was all about providing more things to more people and expanding the opportunities and expanding growth. But in the middle of this process, he stops short. And in a chapter on the stationary state economy, he says, I am not charmed with the ideal of life held out by those who think that the normal state of human beings is that of struggling to get on. That the trampling, crushing, elbowing and treading on each other's heels, which forms the existing type of social life, are the most desirable lot of humankind. Here is the father of classical economics, asking a very, very serious question about human nature, about who we are, about what our ideals are. And I want to come back to that towards the end of the lecture. But what classical economics gave us, what the Industrial Revolution gave us, what progress has given us through economics is nonetheless something extremely valuable, beyond that dysfunctional vision of a society tearing itself apart in a relentless competition to exceed the expectations of all those around us. Actually, some good has happened. Developed, advanced economies brought ourselves out of abject poverty. We freed ourselves from very, very common diseases. We cleaned up our water supplies. We built sufficient housing for people. We enabled enormous advances in communication technology. We did good stuff. We increased our life expectancy from around about 45 to 50 in those industrial revolution years to something approaching 80, sometimes exceeding 80 now. And this is a point where we really do have to be honest and reflect that there are places where this concept of growth still, for those very reasons, makes a lot of sense. And I've always wanted to put that in context. And when I wrote the report for the UK government, and I published the book, one of the most important parts of that analysis was this analysis of the statistics of growth. The question of where income growth could, to some extent, be said to be aligned with prosperity, with the elements of prosperity, whatever they may be. Surely, one of the elements of prosperity is the prospect of a good quality of life over a duration that makes sense in terms of the lifespan of human beings and the capability of us as organisms to enjoy life over 7 or 8 decades, those who are lucky enough. But there are those who are not so lucky, and that's why the conversation is a moral conversation. It's why prosperity and the idea of prosperity has moral dimensions to it. For the poorest in the world, those with incomes of less than 10,000, life expectancy is still as short as 45 or 50 years. And as you increase incomes, as you increase prospects, as you improve nutrition, as you bring decent housing and clean water, you bring those people out of suffering. You bring them a decent quality of life. And actually, in the space of that $10,000 to $20,000, you can almost double life expectancy. But after that point, something rather strange seems to happen. There are, if you like, diminishing returns. We don't increase prosperity at the same rate. We don't deliver the gains from income growth in the same way as we do in those poorest societies. And in fact, there's some real anomalies here, because if you look on the right-hand side towards the UK and the USA on my graph, you'll find there that life expectancy is lower than in countries like Cuba and Costa Rica and Chile. So there's something people are doing right in Latin American economies, it would seem, that is allowing for this element of prosperity, life expectancy, to be as good as it is in advanced Western nations, and sometimes better, but only on a fraction of the income. Prosperity is not then just about income. Prosperity is the things that you can deliver partly through health improvement, partly through education, and you can do this graph for all of those things through happiness, the idea of happiness, life satisfaction, and the shape is always the same, that the prosperity gains from income growth diminish beyond a certain point in time, and in some cases even fall as incomes rise. And we look at economies and cultures and societies with the diseases of affluence, with obesity, with the opposite of malnutrition and uber-nutrition, a sense of lifestyles that are undermining the health of society as a whole and costing us as human beings in that process. And therein lies a kind of tragedy, because you have very poor people without enough resources at all, with not enough materials and not enough energy to give them a decent quality of life, and on the other, you have a set of people who are clearly living not just beyond the means of their planet, but actually beyond their own capacity to sustain health in some sense. And that obviously gives us a kind of sense of a challenge, a dream, if you like, the idea that if it's possible to maintain these things that really matter to us on a fraction of the income that we aspire to in the developed economies, then why could we not do that? Why could we not actually achieve the sorts of things that matter to us without relentlessly expanding our income, without relentlessly expanding our material footprint? Now, I know it's a rhetorical question, and I've answered it myself in many of the things that I've written about in more and less complex ways. But the idea still persists that that is a possibility, that if we had the ingenuity, that this limitless ingenuity that Ronald Reagan would like to see in the human species, then we could come up with a form of society that was actually capable of delivering this prosperity without the relentless material throughput. And in the context of climate change, of course, where you know that any expansion in income growth, particularly in the richest economies, is going to deliver you a certain amount of carbon in the atmosphere, and you know that the poorest in the world desperately need that access to carbon. They need to be at least able to subsist and to survive. Infant mortality plummets when you raise income levels from £2,000 to £3,000 per capita to around £10,000 per capita. Huge improvement in the quality of lives. And that depends on those people having access to income growth, and that income growth is largely material growth. It's largely about houses, food, nutrition, transport systems, and so on. So that's a challenge and a dream, a sense of a way to approach the climate crisis, a way to approach our crisis of an over-consumerist, materialistic society that offers out a vision for something that is better. Not entirely utopian, but at least something worth stumbling after if we have the energy, the enthusiasm, the commitment, and the ingenuity to work towards it. You would think it would be enough, actually, for economists now to say, yeah, hang on guys, we had a financial crisis. We practically brought the system down. We've got rising inequality in advanced economies. Every dollar of economic output is increasing the carbon emissions that are destroying our climate. Every development project is tearing down forests and removing habitats from other species. Isn't it about time we began to think about something different? You would expect that there would be enough sense in that argument as a whole for economists finally to say, actually, even as John Stuart Mill himself began to, over 150 years ago, that it might be time to devise a different kind of vision for society. And you will know from all sorts of experiences that you will undoubtedly have had yourselves, if you've tried to have this conversation, that that's just not the case. The G word, growth, is almost like a kind of icon. It's like a religious icon. Watch politicians speaking when they speak about the economy in the EU, in the Brexit negotiations, in your individual countries. The growth word tells people that you are a serious politician. It tells them that you're a serious business person. It tells them that you have social progress at your heart, because growth and social progress are the same thing. Think about those pronouncements and watch where the G word is used and how it's used. And think about taking that G word out of those sentences. Would it really make a lot of difference to what politicians are saying? In fundamental terms, no, it wouldn't a lot, because a lot of what they're doing through those conversations is simply establishing their own legitimacy and importance as serious politicians. And they do it by using coded language, which we all agree on as the foundation for our civilization. And my suggestion to you is that growth is actually one of those bits of coded language, and it's why it's so hard to get away from. So imagine what happens to a society which has a religious affiliation to the idea of continual, exponential, relentless growth. What happens to that society when growth isn't there anymore? So we saw a little bit of that after the financial crisis, and what we saw was panic. We saw politicians running around saying, we must get growth back as soon as we can. We saw politicians saying, now is the time to bring back Keynes. So government stimulus will kickstart the economy and we'll be back on the growth track. We saw anger at the banking and financial system momentarily, but we also saw panic. The idea that we had a financial system that was beginning to fall apart was not an accidental casualty, a small part of a system of economics that could continue without it. It was fundamental to the structure of the society that we were living in. And so what governments did at that time was to rescue that financial system in any way they could. Trillions and trillions of dollars going to the institutions who had been, to all intents and purposes, the architects of that very same crisis. The architects were rewarded, and the cost was the social spending programs that governments had to withdraw. The cost was austerity. The cost was a politics which left thousands, millions of people excluded from basic healthcare services, from the quality of life, from prosperity itself. All of those people were left behind by that dynamic of trying to save an integral part of the system which we believed was essential to growth. What else did we do, in fact, in this relentless search for growth? And more importantly, perhaps, were we successful in getting it back? And that's one of the most interesting things about the intervening years, the years since I was here last, the years since the financial crisis, is a beginning of a realization, even amongst very well-known, well-established conventional economists, that perhaps a world without growth is the new normal. Perhaps, as Larry Summers once said, we're looking at a period of secular stagnation. We're looking at a place where the growth rates decline of their own accord, or through some process that we don't entirely understand, or because we've run out of ingenuity, or because we have a structure which is increasing inequality and there's no longer a demand, there's no longer buying power to sustain this growth-based model. A number of reasons which are nothing to do with the environmental crisis. They don't care that you guys came out here to sit on a rainy Thursday afternoon because you have a program in sustainability. That matters not a jot to much of that argument. But the idea that growth may not be there, that it might disappear, that the growth rate might decline, now that is something that interests them. Because then, what do you do if you are a society with a religious affiliation to growth? Where do you go? What do you try to change? How can you rescue this system? And when you look at a graph like this one, for example, which is a graph of the rate of labour productivity growth over 110 years, and you see a pattern that you hadn't seen before, because it hadn't been so clear before, that we are in a period of decline in terms of labour productivity growth. This is for the UK, but you can do similar graphs for almost any other advanced economy. And we are in a period of declining labour productivity growth in almost all of those economies. What's most striking, of course, when you look at the graph, is that it looks like it didn't have a lot to do with the financial crisis. Actually, the financial crisis is right. It's my last item on the right-hand side here. Before that, we had 9/11, the Iraq War, Gulf War, second oil crisis, first oil crisis. North Sea gas was discovered in the mid-1960s. And that was the peak of labour productivity growth. That's where we get our idea that the growth-based model is a sense of social progress from. But actually the period between the mid-1960s and now is a period of decline in labour productivity growth. And if your labour productivity growth is declining, for those of you who like a little bit of arithmetic, the only way you can keep growth going actually is either to have people working longer hours in the economy or to have immigration into the economy. I don't think they told the Brexit ministers in the UK that just yet. But this is the reality, actually, of a situation where you have declining labour productivity growth. You have to have, if you want growth back in the economy, more people working to get that growth back. And of course, the fact that you've got more people working harder just to get growth doesn't mean that they're improving the quality of their lives. What do you do when you are a country, a nation, a civilization, a culture that believes so inherently that progress is about growth? What do you do when you see this in front of you? Well, one of the things you do is to try and keep growth going as fast as possible, as far as possible. Certainly if you're privileged enough to own capital assets on which you expect a productive return, you will try to protect that return. You will try to ensure that there's a decent return on capital for your shareholders before all their money flies to another country somewhere across the world, or the company falls into the dust. One of the ways that you will do that, of course, is by thinking about how much you pay your workers. And here is an absolutely fascinating graph. This one is from the US. And even though the growth rate in labour productivity has declined, the cumulative growth in labour productivity has continued to increase. This graph goes from 1948 to 2016, and there right in the middle, the year that the limits to growth was published, 1972, up to that point, wages followed labour productivity growth. Labour productivity growth was at its highest, more or less, at that point, and people in work who were creating wealth were being paid in a commensurate fashion. Their wage growth followed labour productivity growth. But after that point, and it's interesting that it's after the decline in labour productivity growth, it's after the oil crises, it's after that shock to the system, what you saw, what you see, what we are still seeing is a widening gap between labour productivity growth and wage growth. Actually, those who are working in the economy are not seeing their interests represented. They're not seeing the return on the labour they're putting into the economy. Why not? Because the response of a society which insists on growth in a world where labour productivity growth is declining has to take out controls over the return on capital. In other words, what's happened in those years is an assault on the value of people's work in the economy and the protection of the interests of capital. The financial crisis was really just the pinnacle of that same achievement, to protect the interests of capital over the interests of those contributing labour into the economy. But what is the impact of that in these circumstances? If your workers are getting poorer, even if you are successful in protecting that capital, what's happening to the fabric of your society? And what's happening to the fabric of your society is it's becoming more and more unequal. In the years between 2012-13, when I was here before, and now, Thomas Piketty published his extraordinarily well-received thesis on inequality, capital in the 21st century. And he and his co-workers have done an enormous amount to establish the statistics of that. And it's really very, very striking. If I can just talk you through this graph. This is a graph from a paper that he published in last year. And it's about who took the share of real average growth over different periods. Now the blue line at the top there, the average growth rate you can see is around about 2%. And the blue dots represent the income percentiles, from the lowest income percentile up to the highest income percentile. What's happening in that graph, the story that Piketty is telling us, is that in the period between 1946 and 1980, Growth made the poorest people richer. It made them better off. It really did bring them out of poverty. There really was a kind of trickle-down effect. Growth made the poorest much better off than it made the richest. In fact, if you look at the average line there, the richest top percentile was barely a half of the average growth during the period, whereas the poorest percentile was around 6 times that average annual growth rate. Now look at the red line. The red line is the story of our generations, of the generations since the 1970s, the oil crisis, the 1980s, the resurgence of a monetaristic economics, the beginnings of a Reagan and Thatcher era of pursuit of the interests of capital, the birth of the financial deregulation that was to lead to the financial crisis. That period has seen a complete reversal of that trend. Now it is the poorest percentile who have seen their incomes fall between 1980 and 2014, and the richest 0.001% who've seen their incomes grow at around 6 times, it's a little less than 6, it's around 5 times the average rate of growth over that entire period. That is a story which in statistical terms, particularly if you love statistics, is absolutely fascinating. In human terms, it is absolutely tragic. It's the story of the poor getting left behind. It's the story of the 1%, but not just the 1%, the 0.001% who have profited from what? From a series of policies whose basic aim has been to protect the interests of capital, and in the process has proceeded in undermining the interests of labour, increasing inequality in society, and creating political instability that nobody in this room, I suspect, has seen in their lifetime. Political instability that means that my country is trying to escape from your countries as fast as it can. Political instability that means there's a rise of nationalist interests that threaten security at city level, at state level, at national level. Political insecurity that has led to an extraordinary, almost despotic government in the most powerful country in the world. And that is a politics that should bring you here night after night. If you can find a place where it's possible to think about that, to place your own future in it, to ask the questions that desperately need to be asked, then by all means come out every Thursday night, whatever the temperature, and fill halls like these, because this is a conversation that is about your future, it's about our future, it's about our children's future, and it's not just about climate change, it's about how we think of our society, it's how we organize our society. It's about how we declare what matters to us. This system, this inequality that has driven our societies to the brink of what some people have even begun to call a new barbarism, has its roots in the way that we organize things. In 2014, Piketty made an almost logical case, a mathematical case, in which he suggested that the reason why inequality has increased is because of the declining growth rate. And that's an argument that sounds quite similar to the argument that I've been making to you just now, that the responses of governments to the decline in labour productivity growth led to situations which alienated workers, protected capital, reduced wages, and thereby created inequality. It sounds as though what Piketty was saying was correct. And it was so worrying to me personally and to colleagues that I work with when Piketty's arguments came out that we went away and we looked at them very, very carefully. And what we did, and I hope it doesn't seem too much like splitting hairs, but it is really important to try and get across, an important point to try and get across, if I can. What we did manage to show is that there are clearly circumstances in which, as the growth rate begins to decline, inequality inevitably rises. But equally, there are circumstances in which the opposite can happen. So the inevitability that Piketty was presenting society with around rising inequality being the result of a declining growth rate is actually fundamentally wrong. And the most interesting thing about it being wrong is it's not about taxes, it's not about fiscal policy, it's not about intervening to redistribute incomes. Those things turn out to be not particularly effective if you want to offset the massive inequality that's coming down the road as growth rates decline. Actually, what it turns out is it's the structural factors that matter. It's whether, in particular, capital is easily or less easily substituted for labour. Whether you can begin to do without people by putting machines in their place. In those circumstances, and of course you'll begin to realise here another huge debate that's enormously relevant to anyone approaching or in working age. Here are the circumstances of a revolution in the world of work, which in some people's eyes will see work disappear from our culture in the space of the next few decades. I want to say a little bit about my own position on that in a moment. But for now, the most important thing actually is that this is a moment of political choice. There's things that we can do with technology, there's things that we can do with taxes. But what really matters is the structure of our economies, the sense of the drift of our legislation, the drift of our regulation. Who do we protect in society? If we choose to protect, as we systematically did over the last few decades, the interests of the richest in society, we will see Piketty's escalating inequality. But this, and it's a piece of economic analysis, I don't expect you to want even to go through it in minute detail, but it is a respected piece of economic analysis built around a theoretical framework that mainstream economics accepts, and it shows very clearly that that is not the only outcome of a declining growth rate. If you protect the interests of workers, if you, for example, think about governments as being the employer of last resort, if you reduce the substitution of people's time into the economy with machines, if you create opportunities to employ people, to allow them to participate in society, then you can indeed not just stall this rising inequality, but reverse it. The only reason that we haven't done that, it seems to me, is because of this religious affiliation to the idea of growth. It has become so important to us, so critical to our sense of who we are, that we've done all the wrong things in terms of creating an economy that works. We've removed resources from those who have most needed it, simply justifying that process through the dynamics and the language, the symbolism, the cultural icon of economic growth. That's, if you like, my part two, my anatomy of a crisis. And to me, it's an important part of an argument that has only really been possible because we have seen the aftermath of that crisis and because we've looked at austerity in the face, because we've understood the economics of that and we've seen its implications in terms of political instability. But it's an argument that is then the foundations to bring us towards the most obvious questions of all. How do we create a different kind of economy? How do we move from this endlessly chasing growth, stimulating it where necessary through speculation and through lending until our credit is beyond the roof. How do we then move beyond the situation where we have to chase green growth, just to refer briefly back to my conversation with Ottmar Edenhofer, and set ourselves astonishing targets of carbon reduction from around 500 grams per CO2 per dollar to virtually nothing in the space of decades, an enormous technological challenge because we are fixated on growth. Can we go beyond that? How do we reverse what we've created in terms of an almost nightmare economy, an economy that does not work, an economy which sees work itself as a form of servitude that we should try to escape from, investment as a casino, a place where we gamble other people's money to make as fast a return as we can, money itself as a form of power, and enterprise as forms of accumulation. And so in this last few minutes or so of the talk, what I want to suggest to you is that we can play a game. It's a game that I kind of drew inspiration from football. I have at various times been something of a football fan, and that would probably strike you, being Germans in the audience, as something of an anathema. I wanted to point out, I missed the opportunity actually, that 1966 was the peak of labour productivity in Britain. Yeah, not everyone's old enough to remember. That was the only year in which England ever won the World Cup. And I can scarcely take an opportunity to be here in Germany and not remind you of that. Lots of people thought that things went downhill after that. And they did. Labour productivity went downhill, for example. And football will one day come back up again. But there's a game that we've played in football over some decades called fantasy football. Some of you may have done it. You choose your teams from anyone that's available, you set up your manager, you kind of play a game where you look at the performance of those players and those teams in the actual football league, and you say, if I had had those people, I would have created the perfect team, the perfect result. I would have created, perhaps, a kind of fantasy economics. What would you do? And here's a question that is really an invitation. I mean, I'm going to give you a couple of suggestions what I would do, but I would take each of those things and turn them inside out. I would take the idea of enterprise and say, do we have to believe that it's just about the material, the mass production of material goods for continual linear throughput so that we can throw them away at the end of the day? Is that the pinnacle? Is that the sum of human progress? Do we have to think about money as power, work as servitude, investment as a casino economy, or is there a different framing? And that's an exercise that is extraordinarily liberating. It's an exercise that is about human ingenuity. It's about philosophy. It's about understanding who we are. It's about thinking that instead, perhaps, of work as